Picture this. You are trying to understand how the chapter of slavery shaped the modern dynamics between Africans and the black diaspora. You see that many, especially in the Caribbean, are particularly resentful towards Africans. But why? Oh, they say that Africans sold their own into slavery. They say that they are keen to betrayal and are rapacious to one another. After all, in exchange for petty guns and items, they put their brethren into the worst system a human can ever experience. But can that be everything? Will we stop there? This is not a proper historical analysis, isn't it? It's a fact that some Africans sold other Africans, but now you need to understand why and how. So we set out to get the context, the full picture. So it was between the 15th and the 19th century. The transatlantic slave trade was reshaping the political, economic and social landscape of Africa. European powers, driven by profit motives, imperial competition and a sense of superiority, established extensive trade networks along the African coastlines. While full territorial colonization of Africa did not occur until the late 19th century, during the slave trade era, it is clear that European involvement was heavily geared towards the export of human lives and natural resources. Now that you have the time frame, you need to know what you're talking about. What is slavery, in fact? The definitions are many, but what interests you are the ways it was practiced. For indeed, when we think about slavery today, we see the transatlantic trade, which was probably the evilest form it took. At the time, it was a worldwide practice. Therefore, the realities must have been different according to where it was implemented. So looking at African history, you see that slaves were not deprived of humanity. They could marry, own property, and even rise in social status. A prominent example of that is the case of Mansa Sakura, who reigned in the 13th century. He was a slave, but then became the ruler of the Mali Empire. Slavery was also not hereditary. The children of slaves were not born enslaved. It was very unlike the permanent, racialized, and barbaric system in the Americas. This raises the question of whether the nations involved in the trade and their respective rulers believed that the captive they sold would have similar experiences in foreign lands. Looking for answers, you see that there is no known evidence that they knew of the fate of the slaves, both during the trip and more so in their final destination. They could maybe guess that life would be hard, but they mostly thought that the slaves would be treated similarly, used for labor, but not subjected to extreme violence and completely robbed of personhood. But what about the traverse of the Atlantic? Well, it was marked by filth, starvation, beatings, disease, and extremely high mortality rates. European traders did not deliver detailed stories, and no slave came back to tell the tale. You could obviously guess that as the transportation and conditions were totally under European control, they likely had an interest in concealing the true horrors of the passage and the plantations. Still, there is a notable case of an African ruler denouncing the trade and its disruptive effects, namely King Vemba Nzinga, also known as Afonso I of Congo. Keep in mind that it was called a trade, thus there must have been economic incentives to participate. It is inevitable, and it must have been more profitable for some locals than any other commerce. First, you needed to know what the Europeans were looking for. you find out that the slave trade was the central focus of their engagement. They rarely ventured inland, so they relied on locals to provide a supply. They built trading posts just for that, such as Elmina Castle in present-day Ghana and Gore Island off the coast of Senegal. In exchange for providing the slaves, they offered guns, textiles of colors, alcohol, and other manufactured goods that were often unknown and precious for the Africans. That is especially true for guns, which revolutionized warfare wherever it was introduced. The immediate effect? A strong incentive for internal warfare and raiding. In fact, kingdoms like the Dahomey or the Ashanti completely reorganized their economy around the slave trade, using European weapons to wage wars and capture prisoners. Thus, entire African societies were increasingly drawn into a violent system of extraction primarily designed to serve European and American markets. You can infer that these movements divided the continent even further than it already was, facilitating its ultimate conquest during the scramble for Africa. Finally, to tackle the betrayal and rapacity argument, it is clear that you needed to dig deeper into the raids and war. You notice that it happened across ethnic groups, meaning Group A would not send its own people into slavery, which then would be true betrayal and rapacity. Rather, it would attack another group and capture them. And considering that Africa is the continent with the most separate language families, totaling at minimum 4, and that it's the continent with the highest genetic diversity, there is proof that many of these ethnic groups used to live quite separately, unaware of or very little involved with one another. That is explained by the fact that it is the continent with the most geographical barriers: Sahara Desert, dense tropical rainforests, the Great Rift Valley, and the mountains in the east, fewer navigable rivers, and few natural harbors, hindering continent-wide interconnection. Even if there were empires like the Mali, Songhai, or Congo, in an empire, the corporation of the entirety of the subject is not guaranteed. Rather, it only means that they live under a singular authority. The people living within can be completely unaware of the existence of others. Such was the case in the vast Roman Empire, or more obviously, the British Empire. In a nutshell, you came to understand that it was easier, with less moral guilt, to attack people you have no attachment to, let alone people you do not even know. You see, there was no Pan-Africanism or a distinct African identity. Perhaps the notion of Africa as a continent did not even exist in people's mind at that point. Our aim with this video was not to shift blame and pin everything onto one group and not the other. All ultimately participated in the events that transpired. We simply wanted to give you a more nuanced approach and a better understanding of these tragic events, an understanding that is based on the broader realities of the time. Truth shall prevail.